October 1929, the stock market crashed, and an era began that would span the next decade, a period that became known as the Great Depression. Banks collapsed. Businesses went bankrupt. Unemployment in the United States skyrocketed to more than 12 million, or about 1/4 of the workforce. Nearly everyone suffered. But as much as Americans of European descent suffered, the African American experience was generally far worse. In the 1930s, unemployment rates for African Americans were double that of the total population. White workers who lost their employment sought jobs that had less pay and lower status, the jobs that were traditionally taken by African Americans.
The African Americans had it worse than anybody else because in the African American community they were at that time a lot of service jobs, porters, cooks, that sort of thing. And as the jobs disappeared for the whites got in there and said, we want you to get rid of these African Americans in the lower paying jobs, these traditional, what they call Negro jobs, so to make room for the white people to come in and take their jobs. So as the trickle-down effect of unemployment happened, the blacks got pushed out the bottom.
In addition to the economic woes, Jim Crow laws, a form of legal discrimination, were still in effect in southern states. These laws denied blacks the right to vote and to adequate schools for their children. The laws also created separate drinking fountains for blacks, segregated movie theaters and restaurants, and the seating of African Americans in the back of the bus. During the Depression, lynchings of African Americans were still commonplace, and membership in the Ku Klux Klan was on the rise.
The decade of the 30s opened my eyes, as they had never been opened before, to the question of race, racial degradation, and poverty, and all the rest of it. I graduated from high school in 1931, the pit of the Depression, and I went to Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee, on a scholarship, on a tuition scholarship. And I had not been in Nashville for a month before I was told in no uncertain terms where my place was. I was trying to come back from downtown Nashville on the streetcar, and I went into the transfer station. I only had a $20 bill, and I gave it to the man with apologies to the agent, the ticket agent, with apologies, saying that I was sorry, that was all the money I had, and he could, if he wanted, he could just give me the change in $1 bills if he wanted to. And he almost leaped through the window as he told me that no nigger would ever tell him how to make change. And I stood there while he counted out $19.85 in nickels and dimes to me.
I went into a restaurant downtown Washington when I first came here. And I sat there and sat there. And, you know, I'm coming out of New York and Pennsylvania, it didn't occur to me what was going on. And finally the young woman came, and I told her what I wanted, and she said, I'm not supposed to serve you. So I said, why? So before I knew it, she did serve me. And then, before I could leave there, she just broke the dishes right in front of my face. I said, what are you doing? She says, we can't use these anymore.
Everybody suffered during the Great Depression. Everybody suffered. But African Americans suffered to an inordinate degree. They suffered most. The economic fabric of many of their communities and their lives were completely shattered. It led many African Americans to leave the South, to continue the Great Migration into northern communities and in the West.
The Great Depression has created a situation where it is forcing blacks and whites to leave their homes and just to be vagabonds, basically, riding the rails, going from community to community, just trying to find their next meal. Many people in America, both black and white, literally did not know where their next meal was going to come from.
At the height of the Depression, 250,000 teenagers were roaming America, hitching illegal rides on freight trains. An estimated 20% of these rail riders were African Americans. They left home for several reasons, some to find work to help support their families, others to relieve their families from the burden of feeding and clothing them. Many of the young wanderers had found the doors of their schools closed. Throughout America, only about 30% of school-aged children attended schools in the 1930s. For African American students in the South, the percentages were even lower.
98% of the African American youths out there were looking for work and riding the rails and going from town to town, homeless. There are all these homeless kids. Now the white kids could go from town to town and not be noticed as an outsider. But if an African American kid went to another town, they knew right away it didn't belong, and so it was even harder for these guys to find work.
Young black teenagers venturing out across white America, homeless and hungry, set the stage for what became one of the most infamous court battles of the 20th century. On March 25, 1931, a posse of 50 men, armed with shotguns, rifles, and pistols, nervously lined both sides of the tracks near the Paint Rock Station on the Memphis line of the Southern Railroad. The men had gathered quickly, responding to urgent calls from the station master and Stevenson, 38 miles up the line. A group of white boys had told him they had been thrown off the train by a gang of black teenagers. The white boys wanted to press charges. The young black boys were to be arrested and brought back for trial. As the train pulled in, the posse rushed on board. Within 10 minutes, they had rounded up 9 raggedly dressed black boys and, unexpectedly, 2 white women in overalls, Victoria Price and Ruby Bates.
When these boys get into an altercation on a train with some whites, and the train keeps on going, they're stopped at the next stop, and they're caught on a train in a similar car where these white women who are of low reputation and who do not want to be arrested for prostitution, because essentially they are prostitutes. They accuse the black people who are on this train, these boys, of raping them.
The 9 arrested boys, soon to be called the Scottsboro Boys, were tied together with plow line, loaded on a flatbed truck, and taken to a jail in Scottsboro. The next day, the Scottsboro Boys were nearly lynched by a crowd of over 100 gathered around Scottsboro's jail. But the National Guard had been called in to ensure their safety, because very quickly, the Scottsboro Boys were becoming a national news story. The state of Alabama hoped to use the trial to demonstrate to the country that mob rule towards African Americans and lynchings in the South was a thing of the past.
The Scottsboro case is interesting because the fact that these 9 boys were even tried was awe-inspiring, because if the cameras were not on these 9 boys, these boys would have just seen the rope and that would have been done with it. The Scottsboro case gives the Alabama government an opportunity to prove that they can try, that Alabama is not just a state where the lynch mob rules. They can prove to the world that they handle their Negro problems with civility and justice, just like they handle any kind of problem. And they have a court case. It's a kangaroo court case, of course. The lawyer who is supposed to be defending is obviously not caring, going to sleep in court and things like that. So they are quickly convicted and sentenced basically to death, most of them anyway.
When the initial trials were over, 8 of the 9 Scottsboro boys had been convicted and sentenced to death. The 9th boy, 12-year-old Roy Wright, was the only one not sentenced to death. All 9 boys remained in prison as appeals were set in motion. Years passed, and after several appeals and more trials, the truth finally came out.
The Scottsboro case opened up to the world audience the idea that blacks in the American South, could not get justice through the court system. And it basically just rallied black America to say that there is injustice and we'll once again fight for freedom. But in that, it destroyed the lives of the 9 boys who were caught up in this storm.
No crime in American history, let alone a crime that never occurred, produced as many trials, convictions, reversals, and retrials as did the Scottsboro case. And although the case helped gain national attention to the injustice in the courts regarding African Americans, 9 innocent teenage boys would pay the price for the rest of their lives. 9 lives that were changed forever on a warm spring day in 1931. Their story is woven into the fabric of freedom song. Their legal struggle helped pave the way for future courtroom battles that, unlike theirs, would end in triumph.